Good evening, everybody. How you doing? Okay, so what I'm talking about today is integrating Webpack in Rails, separate front end from back end for increased developer happiness. I stole this line from Justin Gordon, who is like based in Hawaii, and he inspired me to look into this topic. Basically, he was developing a gem called React on Rails, which basically merged with Webpacker, which we are going to discuss soon. So why we're talking about Webpacker and Webpack basically in general. Well, if you're a Rails developer, I'm sure you're familiar with something called the asset pipeline. You're familiar with ERB, and also we're familiar with a slew of gems that we use in order to integrate JavaScript functionality in our app. So something like the jQuery UI, all those gems, which are basically wrappers, just Ruby wrappers around actual JavaScript libraries. So why not just cut the middleman, so the motivation basically just cut the middleman, let Rails do what it does best. Okay, so in this case, in my opinion, it's active record. That's the best thing about Rails. And let JavaScript do what it does best. So because we have a growing ecosystem, like it's very, very rapid. We have a lot of libraries, we have a lot of support. So why might as well just leverage that to our own advantage. And also we have to decrease coupling between the front end and the back end. So you can see that you develop a traditional Rails application, there's a lot of coupling between the front end and the back end. You don't know when you're gonna separate, you have to reinforce yourself to separate the view logic from the business logic, from the model logic, from the controller in order to optimize your app. Well, in this case, if you're treating the front end and the back end as separate, it kind of forces you to make that separation. So basically, let's say, for example, you decided to move your client code elsewhere away from Rails, you can do that easily with minimal modification. Or perhaps your manager got kicked in the head by a mule and decided to go back to Laravel or PHP. I don't know. So, and also, we're going to have an API. We're going to communicate between the two components by means of API calls. So that's going to be true whether we're going to use the client code basically to communicate with the Rails backend, or we're going to develop a mobile app, for example, and that's going to communicate with the same service with the same backend with the same Rails backend. So one API to rule them all. So you can see there's a whole slew of gems that we can get rid of, and we don't have to worry about many more. I'm just gonna make it like show slide. I forgot. I never used this before actually. Present. Yeah. Yeah. So you can see a whole slew of gems that we don't need to use anymore, and even more like this. Of course, from my last project, I don't think I enumerated all of them, but to just give you an idea of all the gems that we have to use in order to access JavaScript, to integrate JavaScript functionality. So the idea is that we want to access access that directly. So enter Webpacker. So the Rails team, they decided, okay, everybody's going jump shipping to JavaScript and they're using JavaScript. Why not leverage this to our own advantage? So the Webpacker gem is basically, you can think of it as a wrapper. It's basically something that Rails developer can ease into JavaScript world, into Webpack. Webpack basically is like a bundler. So basically what it does is you can, a configuration, it's like a library that you can configure in order to take all your assets. So it's like asset pipeline. Basically, it takes all your assets, like your HTML, your JavaScript, your images, and basically it bundles all your JavaScript and HTML in one giant bundle file, and also it fingerprints them. So basically, every time you do a change, the fingerprints changes. So it knows that the client knows if it needs to fetch to decrease the amount of time that you need to communicate with the server. Webpacker also makes it possible to coexist with the asset pipeline. So you don't have to really get rid of the asset pipeline. But in our case, we went even further and we get rid of our asset pipeline. We are only depend on the pipeline itself. and it compiles by demand, on demand by default. What it means, if you go to Webpacker, so I'm just going to give you an example here. Right. Excuse me. So basically, I'm showing you like an example of Webpacker demo. So what it does is that you have, let's say I'm gonna start like a quickly a demo this. So let's say I make a new Rails app called Rails new Webpacker demo 2, because I already did demo 1 basically. And so what it does is that I can go to this one here, and I bundle it. I have my gem file and everything, but now I'm gonna add the Webpacker gem. So what it does, so I'm gonna have the Webpacker gem. I'm gonna bundle that, and then when I have that, I will basically run the installer to give me all the files that I need to have. So I'm gonna get Rails generate Webpacker install. So what that does, it will install. Okay. No, just have, would not. Oh, okay, I didn't bundle that. Did I bundle? Yeah, I did that. What happened? Webpacker install. Okay, let's look at the documentation. Okay, so we have it here. So I'll create the bundle exact. Yeah, it's oh yeah, it's not a generator. Gosh, okay. It's just like a like a rake. So basically, you do like a Rails Webpacker install, and what it does, it basically copies all the files and runs yarn to install all the packages that you need in your case. So what it does that. So what it did, what it did, it just added some few files. Like mainly, it added like the under a JavaScript folder where it has all the packs. So what happened is that you have um, if you like you have a bin stub, like it creates like 2 bin stubs under the bin directory, which basically wraps around the Webpack configuration. Everything is basically is done for you. You don't have to configure Webpack by yourself, especially if you're new to Webpack. You can do it. Webpack can help you ease into that. So it comes out of the box. You just have to add a line to the application layout. You have to add maybe a router, the router to the index, and if you launch it, and once you go to the page, it will compile. It will compile on demand. So it will see if you have already compiled the assets. If not, it will compile it for you. So you only can do it with one process. So you run Rails server, and you don't have to run Webpack. And also you can run it. You can run Webpack dev server if you want to do like hot reloading, for example. So I will show you, for example, another file since I. Um, so let's say I open up the layouts. So what I can do here, I can add something called the JavaScript pack bundle, which basically is essentially it is a wrapper around the JavaScript include tag. And we don't need that. And also, we can install, let's say I want to use React, because Webpacker supports Elm, it supports Angular, Vue, and React. And you can see that in the GitHub documentation as well. So let's say I want to run and have it and install React. So that will do it for me. So it's gonna set up everything for me. It's gonna install the packages. And before I go ahead, I want to show you the package JSON. So the package JSON, you can see, if I make it, can you see the package JSON file? Can I zoom in here? Okay. Let's just check here. Okay, the zoom here, yes, here. No. Anyway, the Rails, see, you can see the first line. The Rails Webpacker basically is like a node library built by the Rails Webpacker team, but it encapsulates a lot of dependencies, including Webpack command line interface. Also includes other things like Babel loader, and all those libraries, and it bundles them into this Rails Webpacker. And as you can see, I also included the React and the React DOM, and also in the dev dependencies, I have the the Webpack dev servers. If I want to run it on a separate server, and so I can use hot reloading, for example. So in this case, I already have installed that. Now let's see what happens when I launch it. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Resume sharing. Okay. Oh, really? Okay. Anyway, just guess when I'll go to the other way, I guess here. Like everything is done here, so I'm just gonna run Rails S. Um, it's already done here. If I go to localhost, so you can see that, for example, if I change a few things here, it will render it. It will hot reload it. I'm just gonna like quickly go through the presentation because I'm running out of time. It's been here more than 10 minutes. But essentially, React on Rails basically is just built on Webpacker. It's just a different way. It has some few support to help you integrate React, but it's just built on Webpacker. And you can also you can make a custom setup. So basically, you don't have to use the out-of-box Webpack configuration. You can have your own Webpack custom configuration. In fact, you can you can change a directory from under app JavaScript to the client directory in the in the root in the app root directory. And basically, you just have to embrace modularity in this case, as I mentioned, and you're no longer using the gem wrappers around JS libraries, and you just go along with the herd. I hope that gives you a primer about Webpacker, and you can just check it out. And if you have any questions, please come and talk to me later. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. I'm Oleg, and I'm going to talk about how to build content management system in Rails in about 5 minutes. Why would you want to build a CMS in Rails? Because it's not WordPress, and you know, we just build stuff. But quite honestly, like sometimes you just need like a little piece of software that, you know, just shows random pages on your application, because, you know, doing the other way around into WordPress is a pain. If you ever done that before. Where do we start? We start with routing. That's basically the step number one. And the magic of this all is the globbing road, which is basically a catch-all. It basically looks like star something, or just star really. What it really means is that anything that gets to that particular line will be captured and forwarded to the controller, which in my case is pages show. So if you, let's say, accessing full bar and there's nothing else in the routing that will catch it, the globbing route will. There's a gotcha, however, is that if you define any routes after the globbing route, they will not be reachable. So sometimes it kind of like creates a lot of confusion. It's like, well, why is it not loading anymore? Like, why is it getting caught by page show? Generally, like within your application, it's kind of easy to find. It's like, oh yeah, I got that route, plop, I put it in the wrong place. But there's another nasty side effect is that if you're using engines that provide their own routes and they're like auto-mountable, sometimes they will appear underneath your application. Actually, not sometimes, all the time. And effectively, that particular engine will not work. Right now, there's an issue with Rails 5.2 because they have introduced active storage, if you know. And active storage is probably like the first like a full-on engine within Rails code base. So it has its own routes, and those routes are getting loaded just like any other engine does after everything else you have. So you define your globbing route, active storage stuff is not accessible. So for that, you will need to go into config application and adjust the rail ties order. Effectively, what it really means is just it shuffles the loading order of engines. That will fix the order of route definitions, but it kind of breaks everything else. So let's say like if you want to override something within active storage, like you would do with any other engine, you can't. In that case, like you will basically have to literally duplicate the routes and put it inside your application, which is annoying, but right now there's no way around it. Next step, we got the routing. Here's our controller, and controller is like, this is the most basic thing you can possibly do. You literally just go and render a template, right? If the template is not found, you just throw a 404 and, you know, do that. So this is like actually the most simplest thing you can possibly do. And to be honest, like many years ago, I actually had an application component which did literally that, and it worked fine. But that's boring, right? We actually need to manage the content, so we're gonna create something that allows us to actually insert the content in the first place and serve it later. So we'll create pages, why not? So what is the page? Well, the page has a slug or slug line, just like small and identify what the page is. The path, so think about it as like full bar, like the full path of the page, how you get to it. And, you know, content, which is text. Parent ID, we need it in order to create like a tree structure, like you know, like a sitemap, effectively. Like there's a root page, and there's the pages underneath it. They have little children, you know. That's fairly straightforward. This is example of a model of the page, which has many children. It belongs to a parent. It's a self-referential, so it uses the same model. The key thing is really is that when you assign path, you just basically need to compact the slug of, compact the parent's path with your own slug, and you got your full path. The only thing here is that like you can use as access tree. That's a very old school. It used to be part of Rails code base. Eventually, it got extracted through a gem, and the gem got abandoned by Rails people for some reason, and now there's a new maintainer who's keeping that thing alive, and it's quite good. It just manages your parent-child relationships. It has a bunch of useful methods that you should really use it if anytime you have a tree relationship going on. All right, and then we modify our controller. So now we have pages. So all I have to do is just page find by path. Bam, done. If you find that path, just render that thing inline. Shouldn't render inline because that's kind of dangerous, but there's a bunch of different ways you can actually render the content out of a record. This is just an example of it. And if it's not found, then you render your 404. Problem. The problem is that this is too simple, right? Like you literally just dump a bunch of HTML content and you hope for the best. You deploy it, the client goes in, writes invalid HTML, footer disappears. You get a call at 3 o'clock in the morning saying like, oh no, and then you have to go in and figure out what the heck got broken. So for that, you think like, oh, you know what? Why don't we just separate the stuff that the client needs to actually have access to versus everything else, right? We still want to be able to maintain the structural HTML because like, what if we just want to like ad hoc add some element or whatever? So that still needs to be in database. So you do something like that. You extract the pieces of content that you want to be managing, and extract it out. And this is what we're doing. So now we're introducing concept of layouts. So the layouts is content, which is going to be basically this. Pages are going to be the same. The only difference is that we're removing content out of it, and we're just linking it to the layout. So now the page will have a link to a layout that it belongs to. And page will have many fragments, right? And the fragments are just those little pieces. And this is your header, your left column, right column, and footer. This is what they're going to be, right? And they're going to have their own content. And this is like example of what kind of models you would need. So you would need a layout, which really doesn't have anything special. Fragment belongs to page. Page has belongs to a layout and has many fragments. And the magic sauce is really like how do we output the content? And what we do really is that we take the layout, we apply the content from the fragments, glue it all together, and serve it as we did before. Easy, easy, right? If you're not aware, there's a thing called Liquid. This is what Shopify used. I mean, still uses for like the longest time ever. Specifically for this kind of a thing, like where you replace these tokens with content which is sitting somewhere in the database, right? It's more like it's a very safe way of allowing users to like do more complicated things than just putting like text. Don't forget the admin backend, right? Because you need to actually build all that stuff up. And everything else is, if you don't want to do any of that stuff, this is a good alternative. I built it many, many years ago, recently got updated for to be working with Rails 5.2, and basically functions the way I described it. It's pretty good. Check it out. If you ever have a need for CMS, and you really shouldn't be building one. Really, it takes way more than 5 minutes.
I want to do a quick talk on something I stumbled upon the other day when I was trying to kind of debug. I do a lot of puts debugging when I'm trying to get deep into like figuring out what's going on in a gem or something like that. It's really easy to just add some log lines and see it go by in your server. But one thing that's really hard, especially with when you're working in a Rails project, is the absolute vomit of logs that you usually get, like active record logs and that kind of thing that go by in your development console. So it's hard to make just a puts line stand out somewhere. And if you don't want to use like Rails logger, you want to see it in your terminal standard out. It can be kind of tricky, and I've sometimes put like asterisk, 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 line, asterisk, asterisk. But then so puts obviously outputs to standard out by default, so it'll get mixed in with all your logs. I just realized the other day when I was doing something that I could just use standard error.puts, which will put it onto the standard error stream in Linux. And then what that lets you do is when you run your Rails server, you can redirect your standard out logs to dev null. So basically pretty much any Rails log is going to log to standard out by default. So if you add this to your Rails server line, you won't get any of the normal logs. It'll just go into the black hole of silence, which means that your puts lines will show up really easily. And I found that really helpful for if you're like adding a puts into like a gem somewhere that you want to see that go by. And you don't really have access to like your own Rails logs in there. So puts makes it really easy. So that's basically it. I think it's a really simple trick that might help people. Lightning talk, 1 minute. So yeah, thanks everybody.
So that talk is called "Oh No Conditionals," and it's about the story at Nbounce. Because a while back I was working at Nbounce. I actually can't see my cursor. It's not handy. So Nbounce, that's where we are, and Nbounce is a web app that allows you to create landing pages, that's a landing page, and to publish it anywhere on the interweb. And the goal there when you publish a landing page is really to get people to give their email most of the time. So give their email to get a ticket for something, to buy something, to maybe sign up for a newsletter, etc. And so every person who gives you an email, we call that a lead. When you're on the Nbounce admin side of thing, you can configure things so that whenever a new lead leaves its email address, you can send a webhook to your web app, for instance, to sign them up to a newsletter or something like that. So you can click that button and then configure your webhook and say which URL you want Nbounce to post to. That's pretty simple. Now, at Nbounce, you can be an admin user, but you can also be a view-only user. And so in that case, you want this button to be disabled. Or maybe you don't have webhooks on your plan, and so you want that button to be disabled. And obviously, product and or designers will say, well, it's nice to disable the button, but it would be way better to tell people why they can't click on that button. And actually, the easiest way would be that when they click, when we render that model, we should instead display a message. And that message could be things like, sorry, you are a view-only user, you should ask an admin to add a webhook. Or maybe, sorry, you don't have webhooks on your plan, you should upgrade. Or you've reached the limit of webhooks, you should upgrade. Or if you've reached the system limit of webhooks, you cannot add any more webhooks. Or maybe you can buy packs of 10 webhooks, what we call add-ons. So you can either upgrade or buy a pack of add-ons. Or maybe you're not authorized and an admin should update, and so you want to display that. I'm not kidding, that's what it looks like. And that's basically what we got to work on at Nbounce, like all those scenarios for all those cases. Now, I guess we were quite smart about it because we thought, wait a second, if we're building that for webhooks, then we'll have to build that for every single integration that you can see on this page. So it would be nice to make something that's quite generic. So we have kind of templates that we can inject the feature name in and that can render the different variations of it. And here you can see the different variations of it. When you're not authorized to add custom email templates, we will render that template. If the feature is not available, you should upgrade. That's the name of the template, and that's the content of the template. And here you have all the different variations. So basically, what we want is to have a function that or a method that, based on different parameters, will return the name of the template that we should use. So when you get to implement that, you define this this method. It's basically, can you see that, or is it too small? Okay. Make it a bit bigger. So that's the method, right? It's a method that returns a template, one of those templates above, reach plan limit or new, you should buy add-ons, or you reach the system limit, etc. And it takes 4 parameters. One of them is whether you're authorized or not to perform this action, like you're an admin or you're a view-only user. Whether the feature is available or not on your plan, whether you can buy add-ons or not. And then we have this fancy limit thing that's a symbol that tells you whether you're within your plan limit, if you've reached the plan limit, or if you've reached the system limit. And then you start implementing that method with if statements and if statements and if statements. And that's definitely what you get to, right? You have your 4 params. Each of them have 2 to 4 different variations. And so you just implement all those crazy conditionals. I haven't tested that, actually. I wrote that. I'm pretty sure it's kind of correct. But then when you get that, you really want to test it to make sure it works well. So maybe you can refactor that, and instead you can write code like that. That, okay, is smaller, but it's pretty hard to know what's going on, and it's very likely that there is a bug in there. Now, if you think a bit more about the different variations that we're talking about, you could just define that on a spreadsheet, right? You have your different parameters like authorized, which are available, a done available limit. And based on the combination of those 3 variables, that's the template that you should get out. That's kind of easier to read than the if statements, and it's pretty easy to figure if something is wrong. As you go through every single line, you're yeah, this one is correct, yeah, this one is correct, yeah, this one is correct. Now, what if we could have that in Ruby code? And Ruby is magic, so obviously you can. You can just turn that table into those rules, basically. So that's a hash. It could just be an array of array. It's a hash where for each combination of condition, you then have the template that corresponds to it. And that's quite easy to read. It's quite easy to, well, just make sure that everything is fine. And you don't have to write much tests. You just want to make sure that like things are like hooked up properly. But that's actually it. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about switching to headless Chrome for like CI system testing and that sort of thing. Just talk about what I'm talking about, how to set it up, some changes to your test scripts that you might have to do, and then my very unscientific performance evaluation of the new approach. So what is it that I'm talking about? System testing, where you want Ruby scripts actually driving a browser, executing JavaScript, your full up thing, and you want to do it on CI or some other kind of background or headless configuration. Like I use a Vagrant box a lot of the time for stuff I'm doing, so you don't have a browser in the basic Vagrant box. So the old way is typically we used Capybara, basically around your scripts or running your scripts, Poltergeist to interface to a backend that was kind of a headless web browser called Phantom.js. The new way that seems to be emerging is Capybara, Selenium, and headless Chrome. Why switch? Well, I switched because I found I started using Bootstrap 4, and some of the CSS in there was laying out Phantom.js couldn't lay out the page correctly, so my scripts would break because things were like way off the screen, and the script couldn't find a button that it had to push. So, and when I started looking around, I realized, okay, Phantom.js isn't supported anymore. All respect for Arya Hidayat. He, did a tremendous amount of work for many years, keeping that thing going. But he saw the writing on the wall, headless Chrome is coming, and kind of said, we're not going to keep this around anymore. And in fact, Rails 5.2 is going to have the headless Chrome built in to the system test. So it's all there. So the one thing you might have to do if the box doesn't have Chrome is you're going to have to install it. If you're just doing it on your desktop, you probably got it there already. So whatever your platform is, you'll install Chrome. Rails 5.1, and probably earlier, I never tried it on anything earlier, but Rails 5.1, you do have to type in a bunch of stuff like this. You'll find lots of examples on the internet. 5.2 gets a little bit easier. So when you're ready to test, first thing you do, make sure you're using the latest Capybara. That's probably what you're doing, but I found on the project I was doing, for some reason, I had it pinned in an older version, and caused me a bit of a hiccup, which I don't even remember now the details of. Fill in is, fills in a form field on your form in your test script. I found a bunch of little differences there. If you have some JavaScript that's waiting for a change event on a text field, I found, in the old days, all I did is say fill in the fragment with some text with Selenium. And these are actually probably more like Selenium differences than, strictly speaking, headless Chrome, but I didn't try to figure that out. Anyway, if you want the change eventifier, you have to actually put a new line or something at the end, or do some other thing like navigate away from the text field explicitly or whatever in order to get the change eventifier, which is actually, strictly speaking, probably more realistic browser behavior anyway, right? Or more realistic test script behavior anyway. I had some date time fields that sometimes I wanted to clear them out, and the old way, I found I could just set it to an empty string. That didn't work anymore, so I had to explicitly delete it. And then, although the Vagrant box I was doing this on, I was pretty sure it had the Canadian locale and everything set up. For some reason, when you're putting dates in the new way, I had to put it in the format that's only used in one country in the entire known universe, and which is not ours, right? Month, day, year, that strange format that country uses. So anyway, it's probably actually more just I don't have the locale set up right, or at least I would hope so, but anyway. In the old days, alerts were accepted automatically by Again, probably Phantom.js or something in that pipeline. So there's an accept alert method, and you put your click link delete inside that, and then it'll get accepted automatically. But it can be a little bit of tedious going through all your test scripts looking for that. And interestingly enough, empty divs, probably empty, possibly empty other tags are considered invisible by Selenium. So if you were, for whatever reason, looking for an empty div, you'll have to add the visible any on that. One kind of a bummer is that you don't get the console, the JavaScript console output in sort of real time automatically. All you can do is in your test script put this line, and then it'll dump out whatever it's got, whatever's been console.logged out. And finally, my particular project ran about 50% slower. GitLab said that their test suite ran in the same time. And I saw some other one that when I was poking around trying to get some information who said theirs was twice as long. So, but on the other hand, they ran correctly, which is always, a wrong answer that you get quickly is often not particularly useful. So that was that. And so that's my blog on it. GitLab actually had basically the same information, but a lot more background stuff. It's a more recent post, so I wish it had been there in the first place, and I wouldn't have to go through an afternoon of figuring all this out. And my contact information there. And I apologize for not doing directed to cyclic graphs. I could not figure out a way to say anything interesting in like a lightning talk time. I have some other ideas, but maybe next time. All right? Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. So I was hoping you're going to do pessimistic thing first, but pessimistic thing for last. But anyway, so it's, the talk is about pessimistic offline lock and vanilla Rails application with some of the examples and test code. It's available on that URL. A purpose of it, and before I, it is not to be confused with the database, strictly database system locks like pessimistic lock that is using database or optimistic lock in database. Basically, it's a tool or patterns, as they call it, enterprise pattern. It prevents conflicts between concurrent long business transactions when you want to serialize access over a certain graph of objects. So typical scenarios are editing or accessing complex business such as like large worker order, 5 patient records with a lot of child records and insurance cases for single plans and so on. When you don't necessarily want, or you want to basically control only one user at a time, only one business user at a time accessing records. So let's consider just a quick hospital patient management system. We have typical entities: patient, physicians, appointment, prescriptions, insurances. They look, here we go, that's kind of like schema, how it looks like. Patient, physician, appointments. And this is basically a sequence diagram describing this general requirement where editing a patient or associate entity, making referrals, adding prescriptions and so on. When one doctor starts editing patient or subordinate records, the other doctor shouldn't be allowed to access that record or should be notified when attempts to. So a business transaction really spans multiple requests. The way we are doing that is we are acquiring a pessimistic offline lock, in this case patient lock, initially when first user attempts to obtain a record that is available, and holds that lock during the whole sequence of multiple edits. How is that done in our code? It is a little active record extension. It's include active record pessimistic locking. So basically, and if you look at the bottom of that little Ruby code there is patient find, and then with pessimistic lock, those are the extensions included by the module. Basically, it accesses that record in a mutually exclusive way for that particular current user, notifying what it's doing, and then eventually editing the record. So here's one test, and that explains. So sorry, it's scrolling, not rendering well, but it's a first patient in the fixtures accessed with pessimistic lock for current user editing. And if we try with a different user access that record for editing, it's not allowed because pessimistic lock it's required. Now lock is reentrant such that if you have multiple actions, for the same user accessing the same record, accessing the same lock, it will basically allow it to do so. Basically, that's what allows organizing the sequence of steps to finish. And now, basically, how is pessimistic lock implemented? It's actually basically it's very simple. It's a very simple table. So it's typical structure which has object type, lock, object ID, and lock holders. Those are the three fields that define the uniqueness of lock. Basically, object type is usually your class of active record model. Can be anything really, because you can include that, include the module in any class. Lock object ID is delegated usually to primary key or to some other uniquely identifying element of the object. Lock holder is who is actually doing the reason, entry information, expiry handler created that, updated that, are timestamps that are used as information in eventual cases. If you use the abundance use case, locks survey in database, there is a little recurring cron job or something that eventually goes and finds the all expired locks, abandoned locks, orphan locks that are ready to. So this is how the when we acquire a lock, that's how the record gets created in the database and shows that Dr. Green keeps that lock. Yeah, it has some information with object ID, what is holder, what is the reason, and so on. It's a very wow, what is that here? Sorry. So it can be actually implemented with controller acquiring pessimistic lock. Sorry, this messed up a little bit. My markdown messed up. But basically, you can. What I wanted to show here is controller actually acquiring pessimistic lock can be with a before filter or before action. You can basically ensure that the sequence you're entering in your editing simply editing, and here it's showing actually before action it's acquire patient lock. So this is a private method acquiring patient lock, and then whenever a user is accessing any of the models of that particular business domain here, hospital management system, basically the lock for that particular patient is acquired by a current user. It's a reusable general purpose pattern, can be used by delayed active job workers and so on. And sorry for misspelling. Yeah, that's what it is. It's a very simple tool. I often come back to that tool when I need to organize some serialized access to records. Basically, it frees you from the all record locking management after, because when your application is organized in a way in those blocks where you are acquiring lock, and later on you don't need to do any particular more granular type of locking. It's basically you have this begin end sequence organized with that pessimistic offline locks. And yeah, that's pretty much it. That's just a couple of locks. Yeah.
How do you release the lock?
you look at the do end, like in the block, right after the exit of the block, the lock can be released at the end of the sequence. Yes. Right. Absolutely, yeah. Oh yeah, that's what those dates, I think I briefly mentioned, that expiry at and created at dates that you put like a guaranteed cleaning of those locks where, let's say you know that your use case will never, editing the patient record, maybe a 5-10 minutes thing, but there is a little cron job that you install to go and purge records that are older than, let's say, half an hour. That's how you allow it. It's a very, very, very simple tool. There's yeah, it happens, but I mean, it's really depends on the business cases, right? I mean, you have like prescriptions, referrals, and so on, and those are data. I mean, when do you have like doctors accessing same patients at the same time? It's usually mutually exclusive, actually, right? Yeah, yeah. Well, you could, but it does really work nicely if it cleans up after 15 minutes on its own, so you don't really have to really worry too much about that. I use the hospital domain. We use that in the payment processing too, which is payment processing domain where I work for. We use that quite a lot. We use that, for example, as a mechanism of double submits instead of monkeying with JavaScript and all these things with double submits. You use simple double submit on your hosted share payment page with this pessimistic locking. And there's no way, there's no safer way than really doing it with the ACID properties on database, right? I mean, all this other front end stuff is really way weaker. So basically, just make your action idempotent, or the first one which succeeds, or the next one which cannot acquire lock basically just goes and grabs the receipt because somebody else has done it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the ways how you can use it, but you can explicitly invoke it, just acquire lock, and lock will be there, right? And then there is also the other method, the release lock. So if you look at it through API, there is a release lock of that particular. So when you typically do acquire lock when you open a new referral, new prescription, or whatever, you're acquiring the lock, and then let's say doctor talks with a patient, they're having their own little 5-minute thing back and forth, and decides, okay, I'm gonna give you amoxicillin and so on, and enters that data. And when that update gets sent to the server, first what it does, it reacquires the same lock again, verifies that it still holds the lock, right? I mean, first, when you acquire a lock, and then after it finishes, it's release the lock. And that's can be, usually in controllers, Rails controllers, you'll model that with kind of like with the before action or before filters. So those are the. Another interesting use case is when you have something very, very critical being locked at that point in time. At that point in time, we don't expire those locks. There is a flag also that you can pass. So have that lock is like forever, meaning if because it's such a business, let's say, in our particular case, those are recurring plans. So when they process, and if some crash happens in between, we want to leave that lock so that other servers from the cluster don't pick up that plan, so that somebody actually has to go and look what happened. So one particular instance was when I don't know, this is a little story from the trenches when a database guy, just communication mistake, some wee hours, put the database in the read-only mode while the recurring plans were processing. So the communication with the financial institutions going on, authorizations were happening, but the updates could not go through. So at that point in time, the best thing really what you can do is to leave that lock there. So you don't want to start another job after that, because and you have to go and pick up stuff from your application logs and understand what really happened and what was recorded, and then stitch the data out. Right? So yeah, so those are the. But it's one of those simple tools that I quite often come back to, in a sense, when you need that. Yeah, I know this people work for me. And because, like I said, because it's a one table, it's easy to monitor. It's easy to monitor for support people as well. So we have a little bit of a UI showing that, so they can, basically those object type and object ID points to our business records. So they can, there is a little bit of a UI that shows them directly what records are being acted on and affected. So, welcome.